All right, here we come to a nice big area, choosing a finish. All right, the first question is, which finishes are food safe? It's going to be easier to answer that in reverse. And I'm trying to think of any finishes at all that are not food safe. And about the only thing that I could think of are conditional situations. So, for example, if you use walnut oil on something and the person's allergic to tree nuts, it could be harmful to them. If you used a non-drying oil like peanut oil or olive oil or any of the vegetable oils, they tend to go rancid on the wood. But again, that may smell bad, but it's not going to hurt you because you're not going to consume enough of it to matter. Any film forming finish, all film forming finishes basically create an inert plastic. So it's as safe as any inert plastic. So pretty much, I can't think of any finish, any common finish that is not safe for food contact. Having said that, I will tell you that the term food safe or food contact safe is not a practical finishing term. It's a legal term. It's a legal term. That means if you want to sell products and say that, then you get into this legal murky area. In fact, what you're putting on there is safe, but you can't necessarily say it unless the company selling you that finish also says it on their can. How do they go about doing that? It's real simple. They take their finish and they submit a finish test to the Consumer Product Safety Commission, who then says it's food safe. That costs a lot of money to do, so very few companies do it. So what's the difference between regular oil-based finish and salad bowl finish? It's that they spent the money to get food safe imprimatur on their label. Other than that, I mean, think about your dining table. If food dropped on that, would you hesitate to eat it? So essentially, there aren't any finishes that cure to a solid film that are going to get into your body or into the food. So if they can't get into your body and can't get into the food, then that makes them food safe for all practical purposes. Okay? Which finishes are hardest? That is most durable. Number one, hardness and durability are not the same thing. I'll give you an example. If I were to take a piece of glass and a razor blade and tried to cut the glass, I wouldn't be able to cut it. That's hard. But if I took a hammer and hit the glass, it would shatter right away. On the other hand, if I took a piece of rubber, I could easily cut that with the razor blade, but if I hit it with a hammer, nothing happened. So which is more durable? Well, durability has to do with what it is you want it to endure. That's very important. For example, you can have something that's extremely hard, but not necessarily durable to something you subject it to. A good example of that is ice, okay? If you remember the Titanic, you'll realize that that iceberg was hard. It was damn hard. But put some heat on ice and it turns into water. So what is it that you want the finish to endure? Does it have to be heat resistant, stain resistant, chemical resistant, scratch resistant? How much does it have to move and how flexible does it have to be? All of those things have to do with durability. So in order to answer that question, you first have to say, what do I want to subject it to? And which finishes will tolerate those specific assaults? Okay? All right, so let me give you some examples. Both shellac and lacquer are very hard. They're brittle finishes. They're very durable. They're very waterproof. They're very stain resistant. They're only somewhat chemical resistant. They resist some chemicals, but not others. And neither one of them is particularly heat resistant. if you had a shellac finish on a tabletop and you set a nice hot pot of coffee on it, it's going to melt it. Why? Because shellac and lacquer are amorphous solids. They have what's called a T sub G, a glass transition temperature. That means at a certain temperature, they stop acting like solids and start acting like liquids, just like glass does. That's why it's called a glass transition temperature. The glass transition temperature for shellac is very low. It's somewhere between 160 and 180 degrees Fahrenheit. So a 212 degree hot pot of coffee could easily melt that. So you follow what I'm saying? You really have to decide what it is you want to protect against. Some finishes have better scratch resistance, some have better heat, some chemical, some stain resistant. One of the most popular finishes that you yourself can use, not a high-tech finish, one that doesn't require any equipment to apply other than your hands, is oil-based polyurethane. Oil-based polyurethane has excellent heat resistance, very good stain resistance, very good chemical resistance, excellent chemical resistance, and very good scratch resistance. And those are usually the four things that we're most worried about. So that's a really good one if you want to use that. There are high-tech finishes that also have all of those properties, and sometimes even more properties that they will impart. But I don't really want to get into high-tech finishes tonight. We can avoid it. So what do I use on this? This is my work table. If you want to know what it's finished with, it is finished. It's finished with oil-based polyurethane. And I'm going to show you in a minute how I apply it. And every now and then, if it needs to be rejuvenated, you just sand it and put on another coat, and you're good to go. And by sand, I mean just lightly scuff sand. So just rough it up a bit and then put on another coat. What is conversion varnish? That's an interesting question. For a long time, the standard finish, starting around 1917, the standard factory finish for furniture was lacquer. Why lacquer? Because it sprays very fast, it dries very fast, it's very forgiving, it flows out well. It's a delight to use. If you're spraying a lot of finish, especially in a factory, there's nothing more delightful to use than lacquer. And by the way, lacquer, the reason it was developed when it was, which was around the time of World War I, is that prior to that, shellac, which is about the same as lacquer, formulators call both of those lacquers. Shellac is a lacquer. They're both evaporative finishes, which means that they go from a liquid to a solid only through one mechanism. The solvent evaporates off. That means the molecules that were in the can as a liquid are the same molecules, the same size, that are now on the finish dried up. So long about World War I, it became difficult to get shellac resin because shellac only comes from two countries, comes from India and Thailand at that time. Plus, it's a natural product, meaning it's made by bugs. So there's not a whole lot of control over how much is made. So the call went out for a synthetic shellac, and they came up with lacquer. Now fast forward to, I guess, the 1970s or so, and all of a sudden people decided, I want that same finish that's fast and easy and nice and clear and beautiful like lacquer, only once it's dry, I want it to wear just like Formica. This is unreasonable. So what did we do? We came up with conversion varnish. And what conversion varnish is it's a material that handles and behaves exactly like lacquer. You spray it on in thin coats, it dries really quickly, but there's an activator in it. In fact, it's an acid. Usually we use para-toluene sulfonic acid or phosphoric acid, and there is an activatable resin in it. so that when those two come in contact, instead of just drying, it links up the molecules to form larger molecules. Rule of thumb is the bigger the molecule, the tougher the finish, the more durable the finish in that sense. So we want to cross-link these. Conversion varnishes, you can formulate them any way you want, but typically they're formulated so they dry just like lacquer and they cure in about 8 days. And when they cure, they're closer to Formica than they are to lacquer. So that is what conversion varnish is. It was the answer to, I want the durability of Formica with the convenience and sprayability of lacquer. And now it's available to everyone. I have to warn you that the problem that showed up first with conversion varnish is that you have to mix it very accurately. Anytime you have a chemical reaction going on, you have to mix it very accurately. That was one problem. The second problem is that at least one of the common acids we use for kicking it is very dangerous to handle. The original conversion varnishes usually mixed at about a ratio of 40:1. That requires some really strict measurement. And a lot of times shops weren't able to hold to that. So they started having problems. So they came up with something called pre-cat lacquer. And what they did is they said, how about if we take this conversion varnish and we add a smaller amount of acid so it takes longer to kick over, but we add it in the store before we give it to you. So all you have to do is you don't have to mix anything. You just spray it on and you get sort of conversion varnish without the fuss or muss, but you don't really. Here's why. Depending on how much acid they add and what type of acid, it's going to kick over more or less. So if you have lacquer here in terms of durability and conversion varnish here, where along that line is pre-cat lacquer? It can be anywhere in between. It can be right here, just a little bit better than lacquer, or it can be fairly close to conversion varnish, depending on the company that's making it, how much pot life they put into it, and a bunch of other things. Therefore, pre-cat lacquers are a bit of a crapshoot. You don't know what you're going to end up with as a final finish. As a result, when commercial factories make things like kitchen cabinets, they generally shy away from pre-cats and go with real conversion varnish. It is very durable, much more durable than lacquer. So I'm not a big fan of pre-cats because they're a bit of a pig in a poke. You don't really know exactly what you're getting. Where was I? Conversion varnish. What finishes can be mixed together? Well, you can mix finishes that are the same as another finish, but they have to be the same. How do you know that they're the same? That's a tougher question. It really is. So I can't give you a blanket statement of that this will mix with this and this will mix with that. As a general rule, oil-based varnishes, whether they're alkyd or polyurethane, are pretty much compatible with one another. I say pretty much, but not entirely, because there are secondary considerations. The amount of dryers that are in it. Dryers are added to these finishes to help them cure faster. That can be different for different materials, and if you mix them, you get a Frankenstein. You get something that isn't really one and isn't really the other. So I don't think it's a terrific idea to mix finishes, and I'm not sure why you would want to. If you know enough about the formulas and enough about formulation, there are things you can mix together. But lacking that information, it's not something I would recommend you do. It really isn't. Can you get away with it? Yeah, a lot of times you can. Can it come back and bite you? Yes, it can do that as well. So unless you absolutely have to, don't do it. And I can't off the top of my head think of situations in which you absolutely have to. That's one of those questions like, I don't want to go to the store and buy more, and I found this old can of such and such. Can I just dump them together? If you gave me all the specifics, I could answer that, but I'd still tell you it's not a great idea. Okay. What advantages come from mixing finishes versus layering them? Wow. There are damn few advantages to doing either one. Layering finishes has its own set of problems. You want to know what some of them are? Well, for example, you can have a finish that has less heat resistance under a finish that has more heat resistance, and you'll confidently put something hot on it and the underlayer melts. That's a problem. You can put finishes on top of one another that don't really coexist well, so down the road they can delaminate. You can put a layer of two different finishes on that have a different refractive index. What does that mean? That means they change the speed of light entering them. And if you change it enough and enough times, it starts getting hazy. The best example of that is an emulsion of two clear materials. And then when you mix them together, they appear white. And what I'm talking about is milk. If you let milk dry, it's completely clear. Where did the white go? Well, there was never any white in there. There were two clear elements with different refractive indices, and they're mixed together so that the light is constantly changing speeds. And when it does that, it looks white to us, or smoky, hazy. So there's a lot of reasons not to layer finishes, just like there's a lot of reasons not to mix finishes. When would you do it? There are situations in which you need to put a specialty sealer underneath a different finish. In those cases, you want to choose your sealer wisely based on what it has to do, and you want to put on only enough to seal the wood. Don't build up with it. So what's an example of that? If you're spraying something made of, say, rosewood, and you're spraying it with lacquer, and I'm going to take the example of a guitar, and it's bound with white binding. Well, where that white binding comes in contact with the rosewood, you're going to find that the rosewood bleeds onto it. So sometimes we use an isolating sealer to prevent that from happening, and then switch to the lacquer after that. Another example, oddly enough, is also with woods like rosewood and eastern red cedar, which is aromatic cedar. Both of those categories of woods contain an antioxidant. Now, oil-based finishes, that's Danish oil, boiled linseed oil varnish, oil-based polyurethane, they all dry the same way. They take oxygen out of the air and use that oxygen to cause the molecules to link up, to hold hands permanently and make bigger molecules. An antioxidant prevents that. Well, some woods contain a natural antioxidant. You've experienced it in citrus fruit. Citrus has an antioxidant in it. And if you take your guacamole and you drift a little layer of lime juice on top of it, it won't turn brown. Why? Because it's an antioxidant. Well, if a wood contains an antioxidant, it can prevent certain finishes from curing. So the example with rosewood is that many times oil-based finishes won't cure over it, or if they cure, they only cure at the top and the bottom is still liquid, so it'll peel off. They'll also prevent some high-tech finishes like polyesters, which also do an oxygen cure. So polyesters can also be prevented from curing by woods like rosewood and aromatic cedar. So if you have a wood with an antioxidant in it, you're going to have to use a sealer that is not affected. What is that? Pretty much anything except oil or polyester. So polyurethane, shellac, lacquer, all of those things will work as a sealer. Typically on standard finishes, if I want to do a polyurethane or an oil-based finish on rosewood, I'll seal it with one thin coat of shellac first. And I use de-waxed shellac that's nice and fresh. And that'll do it. That's all you need. That help? Okay. Otherwise, don't layer finishes. There's so many problems you can get into. And unless you're a finish chemist, here's the thing. Unless you're a finish chemist, you probably shouldn't do that. And if you are, you probably won't. Because you'll know enough of the reasons why not to. All righty. Can some finishes be put over other old finishes? Yes. In fact, there are a lot of finishes that can be put over a lot of other finishes. Usually when we do a chart on those, we just bother with the ones that won't work over others. So I'll tell you a few very quickly. You can usually run into problems with lacquer over a whole bunch of things. Lacquer over paint, lacquer over old oil varnish. In both of those cases, it can crack. More flexible finishes will usually go over a less flexible finish without any problems. Therefore, in most cases, an oil-based finish like oil-based polyurethane or oil-based alkyd varnish will go over almost anything. It'll go over acrylics, lacquers, shellacs, or over itself without any difficulties. Now, obviously, this depends on two other things. Number one, that the finish is clear, solid, meaning, I'm sorry, not clear, clean and solid. In other words, no wax on it, no grease, no dirt. All that has to be removed, and it has to be solid, meaning it can't be. Have you ever seen finish where it turned into something that looked like chewing gum? That's something called plasticizer migration. If the finish integrity is no longer what it was and it's now soft, you can't go over it. You've got to strip it off. The second consideration is that the finish has to be adhering well and has to be contiguous. In other words, if you have a finish that's already cracking and peeling, putting something over it won't solve that. It'll continue to crack and peel and it'll lift the new finish with the old. So you got to start with a finish that's in good shape. You need to clean it to make sure there's no oil, grease, or wax on it. You need to scuff it lightly. You can do that with a little bit of sandpaper or a little bit of Scotch Brite. And then you can go over it with most other finishes, certainly with most oil-based finishes. Okay? And yes, you can go over paint with other paint. In almost all cases, when we're talking about all the paints we buy nowadays are water-based, they're basically acrylics. And yes, they typically will go over old paint. Once again, clean it, rough it up a little bit, and you're free to go. So there's a lot of cases where you can go over an old finish with a new one. What should the first coat of sealer finish be? In a lot of cases, it should be the same thing as the last. In other words, there are only a few times when you need a specialty sealer, and I discussed a couple of them already. You might need a specialty sealer because the wood you're using contains an antioxidant. You might need a specialty sealer because the wood you're using tends to bleed color. You don't want it to. You might need a specialty sealer because you're using lacquer and the wood that you're using is excessively porous. And you'll find situations where you spray a coat of lacquer and all of a sudden it looks like you did nothing. It's like water running through sand. So you say, wait a minute, I'm going to be doing this forever. What do I do? Well, there are sealers that will stop that very quickly. One of the best ones, oddly enough, under lacquer is shellac. Why does shellac work that way? It works that way because not only does it have good adhesion, which means it sticks to the wood, it also has good cohesion. So it forms this film almost like laying a piece of saran wrap over the wood. And it blocks it so that the other finishes sit on top and build up instead of just being absorbed in. Now, how do you apply that first coat? There's only one way that I apply sealer coats. And it's the same way I apply the first coat of anything that I put on, if if I possibly can. I usually can, and it's just what I showed you on that walnut. So I would take my shellac, put on some gloves so I don't have to wash my hands later. I would take that shellac, I'd scrub it onto the wood, wipe it evenly, and I just put on my coat. Why that instead of spraying or brushing? Well, it's pretty simple. If you're working with solid wood in particular, it's less of an issue with plywood. But if you're working with solid wood in particular, the end grain, whether it occurs on the surface as swirls or run out, or if it occurs on the edge, the end grain is going to absorb a whole lot more finish than the flat grain. So if I were to spray an even coat of lacquer on there, I'd get some on the flat grain and virtually nothing on the end grain. It would have all sucked in. However, if I were to take that same piece of wood and simply immerse it in a tub of finish and let it soak up as much as it could, then pulled it out and wiped it all off, where it could absorb more, it would have. Where it couldn't, it wouldn't have. And I've now wiped the surface uniformly. I let that dry, and my next coat's going to go on very evenly and uniformly. I'm not going to get sucking in on the end grain. Well, it's not always practical to take your pieces and immerse them in a vat of finish. An armoire comes to mind, difficult to do. So what I do instead is I take my sealer coat, which is shellac, and I flood it on. I mean, flood it on liberally, so much that if I'm working with very swirly grain or some punky wood or burls, I'll keep that wet until it stops soaking in. Then I know I've soaked it as much as it can. Then I wipe it off. Now I know I've got something that's uniformly sealed so that each coat after that will do exactly what I want it to do and not run away into the wood pores. Does that make sense? This is a whole lot less of a problem when you're using pore filler on open pore woods, but it's still an issue. Why? Because the pore filler will absorb more finish than the flats of wood next to it. So generally with pore filler, I usually use some sort of sealer coat, and usually it's shellac. It's actually not shellac. I use seal coat, if you're familiar with seal coat.
Yeah.
I use this stuff, seal coat. So what is this? This is the joy of doing class. Everything's right here. Seal coat is de-waxed shellac, but it's not your, what is that Oldsmobile thing? It's not your grandfather's Oldsmobile. It's not your grandfather's shellac. It's very different. That particular stuff is made from something that Zinsser calls C5 resin. And what it is a shellac resin that has a much, much longer shelf life than typical shellac. Normally, if you mix shellac, as soon as the alcohol comes in contact with the shellac, whether it's in a sealed can or not, whether there's any oxygen or not, has nothing to do with any of that. It starts a process called esterification, where the shellac resins are converted to shellac esters. Shellac esters are softer and slower drying. So the more of it that gets converted, the longer it takes to dry and the softer the final finish is, until it's to the point where it's completely useless. Well, how fast does that happen? That depends on how thick the shellac is formulated. When I was a kid, you could buy 5-pound cut shellac. You had to thin yourself. You couldn't work with it. It was almost like tar. Why? Because 5-pound cut shellac has about a 3-year shelf life. On the other hand, if you bought shellac mixed to the way you're ready to use it, which is what that is, that's 25% solids, which is about a 1.5-pound cut, but we don't use pound cut anymore. Now we use percentage solids. That in a normal shellac would go bad in about 6 months. Needless to say, nobody wanted to put that on their shelves, so they didn't want to stock it. It wasn't until 2002 when the patent came out for this modified shellac resin, that companies like Zinsser were able to make something that was ready to use. You don't have to thin it for spraying, brushing, or wiping. It's ready to use, or French polishing. It's perfectly ready to use and has very, very long shelf life. If you're interested in how they do it, simply look up the patent and it explains it very clearly. In a nutshell, they go in and they change the pH of the resin. That gives it a longer shelf life, prevents esterification. How long? I've used Seal Coat 5 years old and had no problems. If you ever want to know how fresh your shellac is or what it's going to do, take a piece of glass, a piece of UHMW or a piece of mica, and put a drop of shellac on it and let it dry. And then you do two things. One, you watch how long it takes to dry. When it's done, you stick your thumbnail in to see how hard it is. To test shellac, you always right next to a known quantity of brand new, freshly mixed shellac. That way you have a double blind test. You have what it's supposed to do and what it's doing, and that lets you know whether you should use it or throw it away. Application. I already answered the first one. How do I get a professional look with a wipe-on finish? And by the way, you can do the same thing with shellac, but you can only do one coat of shellac because shellac redissolves itself each time. With an oil-based finish, you can do as many coats as you want. At one coat a day, one coat per day for as many coats as you want. That's the easiest way to do that, and I showed you how to do that. Do more layers make a harder finish? That's a categorical no. Why can I say no? Because you used the word harder. Had you asked, do more layers make a more durable finish? I would say in some cases, yes. But there's almost always a point of diminishing returns where if you get too thick, it goes the other way. But yes, most finishes a little bit thicker will offer more protection. Does that make them harder? No, it doesn't make them harder. It makes them more durable. So if you have boiled linseed oil, one coat, flooded onto a piece of wood and wiped off, you're going to find there's very little scratch resistance. There's some water shedding, but not a whole lot. There's chemical resistance and heat resistance, but they're not going to matter that much because it's so thin that the wood is almost unprotected. Well, put on 12 coats of the same thing, and now you have something that looks like a clear finish. And yes, it's going to be better at shedding water. It's going to be better at scratch resistance. It's going to be better at a whole bunch of things. So yes, there is an advantage to have more coats, but too many coats and it starts going the other way. If the finish gets too thick, it's likely to become more brittle, more likely to crack and check, and more likely to delaminate. So look at the tech sheets of whatever finish you buy, and they will tell you the ideal number of coats, or at least they'll say, don't go too far in this direction. So you don't want to add too many. Now, there are some finishes that are specifically formulated to only allow a certain amount. For example, Lawrence McFadden, when they were still in business, used to make a conversion varnish that was a 2-coat finish. They advised you not to put more than 2 coats on, but 2 coats was enough. It built up a finish very quickly and very adequately. So there are cases, especially with higher tech finishes, where you're severely limited to the number of coats you can put on. All that information will be on the technical sheet. You should get in the habit of reading tech sheets for various companies. Most companies have both their tech sheet and their MSDS, which is the material safety data sheet that tells you all about safety and handling, cleanup, fire, etc. Most of them have both of those things online, so you can just click through and read them. It's worth doing.